This is Matthew Kratter's Bitcoin University. Today I want to talk about Bastiat's Unseen, Chesterton's Fence, and Bitcoin. And we'll start with an airplane. This is an airplane that just flew back home to the base from an air battle. It looks like this. And the question is, what would you do if you were in charge of repairing it? Most people's initial reaction would be to patch up all of these bullet holes, which we can see there as the red dots. But this actually should not be your top priority if materials are scarce, because the airplane was able to fly back home in spite of all these holes. So what you want to do instead is focus on reinforcing all of the parts of the plane that do not have bullet holes in them. For example, the engines and the cockpit are probably really important. The other airplanes that got hit in those places never returned to base. So this is a good example of what's called survivorship bias, where people focus on the winning examples and think that they're representative of the data sample while ignoring the losing cases. In other words, they're not looking at the full data sample, because in many cases the full data sample is not even visible. I keep reading stories. People will say I keep reading stories about crypto millionaires, so maybe I should buy some crypto too if I want to become a millionaire. What this does, of course, is obviously ignore the vast majority of people who never end up in newspaper stories because they bought crypto and lost money, and in most cases lost all their money. It's the same example of smoking. You'll hear people say, well, this centenarian smoked 2 packs of cigarettes every day of his life and still lived to be 105, so how can smoking be that bad for you? Obviously ignores all the people who died prematurely in their 60s and 70s from lung cancer. Now, this was one thing that the French economist and philosopher taught us in economics. This was Bastiat. In economics, you need to focus not only on the seen, what can be seen, but also on the unseen, and has this famous essay that I believe the broken window fallacy comes from this essay as well, as we can see here. This was Frederick Bastiat. This is relevant to technological innovations in the 20th and 21st century, like the PC, the personal computer, the internet, and now AI. You'll always hear, and I've lived through a few of these cycles now, so I'm familiar with this, you'll always hear the problem, people saying these new technologies are destroying jobs. For example, in the early days, a lot of secretaries lost their jobs and were replaced by Microsoft Word and Excel, and fewer people doing more work and being more productive thanks to technology. We had the encyclopedia companies go out of business, and all the physical bookstores, or most of them, go out of business. And now we hear that AI is taking everyone's jobs. So this is the problem. And people aren't familiar with Bastiat's concept of the seen and unseen. So the seen would be someone loses their job due to the PC or the internet or to AI. And that's what makes a good newspaper headline and article. So that's what people focus on, because it's obviously a very sad thing when someone loses their job and can't support their family until they find a new job. That's the seen thing. That's what ends up taking all the newspaper headlines. But the unseen part is that company saves money that it can use for something else, maybe like buying better lunches for employees, so the food catering businesses in the area are doing better. This is an unseen effect, and so it never makes its way into a newspaper article. Another unseen effect from AI may be that lots of other businesses are actually hiring people to help to integrate AI into their companies, so there's a net job gain across the economy. If you're enjoying this video so far, I'll just pause really briefly here to ask you to help to support the channel. Hit the subscribe button, that does really help. Leave a like, leave a comment, question, suggestion for a future video, and share this video with a friend or family member. Now, the concept of the seen and the unseen is also, not surprisingly, relevant when it comes to the topic of Bitcoin spam and the whole op return debate that we've been going through. When people say that filters don't work, they're actually wrong. Filters do work pretty well when people use them. I've displayed many charts like this. For example, in August of 2025, just 0.007% of op return outputs were greater than 80 bytes. We can see the cutoff here, and this is because Bitcoin Core, up until Bitcoin Core version 30, had a filter that filtered out op returns. Now, a few large op returns did end up finding their way into blocks, but we can see there's this clustering, and it really starts at 80 bytes, which is where the cutoff was, 83 bytes if you're counting the opcode itself. So this is what many Bitcoin Core supporters fail to understand, that the second order effects of filters and a general hostility to spam has always been a part of Bitcoin culture until really recently. And it's not just the filters that stop a lot of spam from being relayed by nodes and thus finding their way into mined blocks. It's also the second and third order effects, because when the Bitcoin community and the reference implementation, which has been Bitcoin Core until recently, when the Bitcoin community uses filters widely, it sends a strong message to spammers and scammers that they are not welcome in the Bitcoin ecosystem. So when looking at the effectiveness of spam filters, you can't just look at the scene, in other words, that large drop-off of op returns above 83 bytes that made their way into a mined block, as we can see here, but you also have to consider Bastiat's unseen. You have to consider all the spammers and scammers who are not currently spamming Bitcoin because they chose to use other blockchains for their spam due to Bitcoin's cultural hostility to this. And the problem with the unseen is it's very hard to measure. It's basically impossible to measure, but this is a very important effect. And if you're not economically illiterate, it's something you should take into account, especially if you're working on the reference implementation software for Bitcoin, because this is what happened in Bitcoin's history. It was Bitcoin Core's hostility to spam that actually drove Vitalik Buterin away from the project. As Vitalik writes in this tweet from November of 2017, he writes the very earliest versions of the ETH protocol were a counterparty-style metacoin on top of Primecoin, which is a different cryptocurrency, not Bitcoin, because the op return wars were happening at the time. And given what certain core devs, in other words, Bitcoin core devs, were saying at the time, I was scared that protocol rules would change under me, for example, by banning certain ways to encode data in transactions, in other words, spamming the Bitcoin blockchain. He was worried that protocol rules would change under him to make it harder. And Vitalik says, I did not want to build on a base protocol whose dev team would be at war with me. Vitalik goes on to write, and op return did end up getting censored. He uses that word, which is pretty funny. He doesn't understand what censorship really is. Op return did end up getting censored down to 40 bytes. So I think it's fair to say that this willingness to compromise protocol immutability to achieve a desired outcome in a particular application made ETH on Bitcoin even then a non-starter. This is Bitcoin history, and this is what happens when Bitcoin core devs and the reference implementation actually has a backbone. A Bitcoin core and Bitcoin community that was hostile to spam drove Vitalik away from Bitcoin and bought us about 8 years of not having to deal with him and his BS on our blockchain. That all ended when the inscriptions hack was discovered and exploited in early 2023, and Bitcoin core devs did nothing about it. I'll put a link to this in the description notes below that talks about how they changed the definition of data carrier size so they wouldn't have to do anything about inscription spam. I also wanted to cover the related concept of Chesterton's fence, which Mechanic mentions right here. It's definitely relevant to this topic of spam filters. Chesterton's fence is named after G.K. Chesterton, obviously, who was an English author, Christian apologist who had a huge impact on people like C.S. Lewis. Even if you're not a Christian, Chesterton is very funny. He's very witty. I highly recommend reading him. But Chesterton's fence goes like this. You encounter a very old fence in the middle of the woods on a property that you recently bought, and your initial instinct, of course, is to remove the fence because it's not doing anything, just like filters don't do anything. But Chesterton's advice is don't remove the fence until you understand exactly why it was put there in the first place and why no one else has taken it down in the past 100 years since it was put up. Maybe the fence builder was actually the smart one, and you're the idiot for wanting to tear it down. Now, 20th century history is the sad story of one Chesterton fence after another being torn down, beginning with the Bolsheviks in Russia, and now extending to almost every modern institution, including Bitcoin's reference implementation itself. Marxists and other subversives, they don't need to call themselves Marxists, but there's this sort of Marxist subversion that we've talked about on the channel. Marxists and other subversives are always the idiots tearing down fences without an understanding of why they were put there in the first place. And this is why it's such a bad thing that Bitcoin core devs failed to fix the inscriptions hack back in 2023 when they still could have, and it was very fresh, and the spam ecosystem hadn't taken a foothold yet. And the other problem is they also, a couple years later, they have now opened the door to even more spam by blowing open op return. I would say that almost all Bitcoin core devs and their supporters seem unable to understand the second and third order effects of their actions. By not showing outright hostility to spam, you're actually inviting much more of it. And we've already spoken before about another example of their failure to understand and anticipate second order effects from their actions. Bitcoin core devs wanted to make mempools more uniform. This was one of the reasons given for rolling out this pull request that blew open the op return filter. So they wanted to make mempools more uniform. They rolled out Bitcoin Core version 30 and blew open the op return filter. Then what happened? What happened is over 20% of the network then dumped Bitcoin Core and now runs knots instead. What's the end result? It's the exact opposite of what they wanted to do. They wanted to make mempools more uniform, but because they didn't think through the second order effects of what happens when you push through a highly contentious change, what happened now is, the state of reality now is that mempools are even less uniform now than they were before this crisis started. So the moral of the story is, if you're just focused on the layer of code, like Bitcoin Core devs, and ignore the social layer, you're actually not a very good dev. And I think this is one of the things that makes Luke Dasher so special, because he understands this software code better than anyone else on the planet. But he also understands the game theory as well, and he's not economically illiterate like so many Bitcoin Core devs. Op return limits, the data carrier size cap, have been protecting the Bitcoin network since 2014. And what has happened recently now is Gloria Zhao and other Bitcoin Core devs just tore down that Chesterton's fence because they're young and arrogant and honestly just not that intelligent. They're just not that bright. This is also exactly the kind of subversive behavior that you'd expect from someone steeped in the academic Marxist subversion, even if it doesn't openly call itself that. That is rife in our universities like UC Berkeley, where Gloria Zhao attended. And if you look at how many Bitcoin Core devs and their supporters talk, they definitely don't understand concepts like Bastiat's unseen and Chesterton's fence. And this is really what we need from devs who are going to be working on the reference implementation. We need them not to be complete woke idiots as they are now. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the subscribe and like buttons. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.